We're going to start this meeting. Marnie, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Mark Gregg.
Here.
Councilmember Elizabeth Jolin. Here. Councilmember Henry Rosenthal. Vice Mayor Sharon Mahoney.
Here.
And Mayor Buddy Pinder.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right, I've asked Mr. Van Cadenhead to lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. All righty. So, Mr. Cole, we're going to move on.
All right, Mayor. Members of the Village Council, members of the Islamorada community, both here in person and online, welcome. We're going to have a legislative agenda workshop this evening. One of the things I want to say right off the bat is we are apparently experiencing a problem with streaming from the website. So while we are certainly trying to get this broadcast live out to all of our Islamorada community, technologically speaking, it's not working right now. However, if you have friends, family, colleagues, others in Islamorada that you can communicate with outside of our online functionality, if they go to our website, click the YouTube link at the top, that streaming is working for our live meeting. But of course, people who are watching online now won't be hearing that. So again, if you'd like to text a friend, call them, let them know, click on the YouTube link at the top of the website, they'll still be able to watch it. And of course, we are recording it for people to replay at a later date at their discretion or leisure. As the night progresses, we'll certainly put that live feed back up as soon as it becomes available to us from Civic Plus, the website company that maintains our site. So, that having been said, let's get started.
So, Mr. Cole, do we know how long that might take? Do we have an idea?
No, there's no estimated time of restoration. We have a trouble ticket in with Civic Plus.
I have a priority ticket in. I'm waiting to hear back from them right now.
Okay, all right.
So for those of you who couldn't hear, we have a priority ticket in, and we're waiting to hear back from that vendor about their estimated restoration target. In the meantime, again, folks can visit our website, click the YouTube link, and continue to watch the live stream without interruption.
Okay, awesome.
All right.
Awesome.
So getting started with the legislative workshop, first thing I'll do is provide just a general overview of what we're doing with legislative advocacy. To have an effective legislative advocacy program, there's some key ingredients to it. First of all, you have to build relationships with your state and federal elected officials. We need to have open lines of communication. That is, they need to let us know when there's things that require our attention, and we need to be able to reach and contact them to let them know of things that we need to have happen, either from a funding or legislative perspective. And so what that translates into for advocacy is partnership and agility, especially when you get live in session. Bills can surface, come out of committee, and begin to get traction really rapidly sometimes. So we need, on the staff side, the legislative team side, the ability to respond under that scenario. So what the legislative agenda does is provide us with some very high-level, policy-level guidance on certain topics of community interest or priority, so that when a particular piece of legislation comes up for consideration and is advancing, we can communicate to our lobbyists, either at the federal level or at the state level, and have them endeavor to influence outcomes in our favor. So that's basically, why you do legislative advocacy, and at the highest level, how you go about maintaining an effective legislative advocacy program. So from a timeline perspective, where are we at today? Well, we have an initial look at the framework for a legislative agenda, and the intent here is to have some discussion around some of the policy topics, kind of outline what we do moving forward, and bring back a completed legislative agenda to the July meeting of the Village Council so that the policy positions that we hear this evening and continue to flesh out can be affirmed by way of adopting our legislative agenda vis-a-vis a formal resolution. So this is a draft that we currently have, and for those of you who have looked at it online or have a printed copy, you'll note towards the end, it isn't complete. It says Public Policy Focal Area 1 and then a position statement. So what we're trying to do tonight is work through some of those public policy statements and the positions. Ahead of coming to the meeting this evening, what we did was a lot of outreach. One, we talked to our lobbyists at the state and federal level, said, you know, what do you anticipate is going to be hot in the next legislative session? What should we be thinking about? We also conducted outreach to our community partners. And I asked them each for copies of their legislative agendas. You know, what are you guys thinking about in terms of the environment, affordable housing, human services, all of those kinds of things? We also pulled a copy of the county's legislative agenda from the last session cycle. What I found in doing that is our June target for completing our legislative workshop is a little bit ahead of where all of our partners seem to be, because in most cases, they haven't started to work on their legislative agendas for the 20 states 25-26 fiscal year. So the extra month that we have to put together and flesh out this agenda in more detail is consistent with what we're seeing amongst our partners that also work on developing legislative agendas. So after we get our legislative agenda fleshed out and we present it to council for approval, from that point forward, the next step would be getting started monitoring legislation as it comes up, as the timing dictates, creating funding priority one-pager so that we can circulate that to our state elected officials and to our federal officials. I'll pause for a moment. All right. Councilman Rosenthal, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Same here. So, getting back on track with the discussion, what we do next is after we present the legislative agenda to council for adoption in at the July meeting, we'll also simultaneously be beginning our budget process. In the context of the annual budget, we'll be identifying projects and seeking to get them funded through a variety of revenue sources, but at the same time, we'll identify the critical couple or few projects that we want to try to advance for state or federal grants or other forms of directed funding to help support those projects. So that's how the legislative agenda dovetails with the budget, is having projects that are appropriated, having them hopefully shovel-ready to get going. Those are all the sources that we would look to identify projects to incorporate on a one-pager that we would then, again, distribute to each of the elected officials and perhaps committee chairs and other people that have influence on the kinds of funding decisions that we're seeking to have made in our favor. We might also do issue briefs as session gets kicked off. We might pick a particular piece of legislation and flesh it out in greater detail and make sure that that gets distributed to each of our state elected officials to make sure they are aware of our concerns and try to the best of their abilities, influence public legislation decisions in our favor. And in doing that, we might also cooperate or collaborate with community partners, the county, because amplifying your voice through multiple people saying the same thing can be, again, an effective legislative strategy. In addition, come January of next year, January or February, there's typically going to be a legislative delegation that comes from Islamorada and goes to Tallahassee to visit with legislators in person. It's Florida Keys Day has been historically the opportunity to do that, and having these other items completed ahead of that allows us to be a little bit more effective when we go and visit with each of those legislators, because we can hand them the one-pagers and we can speak to our local priorities in an effort to, again, gain their support and assistance. So, moving on to the legislative calendar, January to February of 2025, those are the committee weeks in the state legislature. As of today, or at least the last time I checked, those dates haven't been set, so they haven't been announced. We only have a general timeline, and I don't believe that Florida Keys Day has been set yet either. So as that information becomes available, we'll further tailor our legislative advocacy program. And currently, a regular session is scheduled to begin March 4th of 2025. So clearly, we have enough time to make sure we've got a good legislative agenda, make sure we've got good one-pagers, and make sure that we're aligned with the legislative priorities of our colleagues, our peer organizations, and community-based organizations that we want to help support. So, in preparation for the meeting, I surveyed a lot of different legislative agendas. Some of the topics seem to be evergreen in that every year you kind of see the same categories with the same general policy statements in support or in opposition to them. One of the things I did this time was to reach out to our lobbyist in Tallahassee and ask them, point blank, what's going to be hot this year? What are we anticipating coming up? So we can help use that information to inform what we might put in our agenda and or later on our priority cut sheets. And what I was advised, I'll go ahead and read this for the people who don't have it in front of them, but I did receive a report back from them, and that report read, in part, that the speaker-designate, Danny Perez from Miami, was going to become the speaker in November of this year. And he has largely been focused on healthcare, funding for children and adults with developmental disabilities, and property insurance. I was also advised that Senate President-designate Ben Albritton from Hardee County is a farmer by trade and will be focused on agriculture, the purchase of property for conservation easement purposes, and vocational trades. So when you hear things like that and you have legislators in positions of authority, historically, lobbyists and those who monitor legislative progress recognize that the predispositions of the people that control the House and the Senate have a significant amount of influence on what ultimately passes both of those houses and has an opportunity to become law. So it's reasonable to anticipate, based on our knowledge of the people who hold those seats currently, that at least there will be substantial focus on the policy areas that I just illuminated. And to the extent that we have policy objectives that dovetail or align with those particular areas of policy focus, we might be more effective in getting our voice heard because, of course, the message would resonate with the person who is overseeing either House or Senate. So it's useful to know that information. It's not the only thing that moves forward, of course, but certainly either pro or con, we'd want to monitor those areas to see what's happening because there's a high likelihood that subjects or legislative initiatives would tie to each of those subject areas and move forward at perhaps a more rapid or less resistance pace than other topics that we would want our state legislature to consider. So another thing we did was a survey of the landscape. What's been happening in recent legislative cycles? What have they tried to advance, and what, therefore, might we expect coming back in the next legislative session? And I did get a few topics there that I'll cover. Use of private providers for building permits and building inspections. Apparently, that's been a theme up in Tallahassee, and the legislative concern in that regard is that construction is delayed and more costly because property owners need to wait for inspections. And we expect increased attention on enabling alternatives to having municipal inspectors, such as being authorized to hire one's own private inspector and substitute the results of that for a municipal inspector. It's about reducing barriers to development and helping it move along as orderly and efficiently as possible with, in theory, the lowest burden on the development community and, in some respects, municipal staff as well, because otherwise, to meet a time target, we'd have to have more staff and personnel to do it. So that's the state legislature's continuing focus, and we reasonably believe that there may be additional effort this legislative cycle on that same topic. And each of these ones I'm talking about are effectively the same storyline. That is, previous legislative action, we anticipate it coming up again. So rather than restate that with each of these, know that each of the several next bullet points I'm saying are that same circumstance. So the next one is building permit timelines and procedures. Now, the legislative concern there is that construction, again, is delayed and more costly because permit timelines are too long and the procedures are too burdensome. We expect that is our lobbyists, based on what they've seen happening in Tallahassee over the last few legislative cycles, increased attention on timeliness and procedures to make them more efficient and predictable, at least in the eyes of the state legislator. Now, the legislation passed in 2024 reduced the time in half, whereby a municipality was required to issue a building permit in both residential and commercial instances. It's likely, in our lobbyist viewpoint, that there may be additional pressure in that same direction to continue to try to reduce the timeline from point of application to point of issuance. Next one, land use and zoning preemptions. They've seen activity in that area in the last few cycles. And what the lobbyists have advised us is that the development community has criticized local government's exclusionary zoning practices as an obstacle to creating more affordable housing inventory. Now, whether one accepts that as true or not, the legislative trend has been to preempt local zoning to ease development across the state. Now, what does that mean for the upcoming legislative cycle? It can mean a lot of different things, but we will be monitoring bills as they're coming out, recognizing that that has been a trend in the past, and we'll have to weigh each of them in the context of what it means for us locally and whether we support them or not. Next one, municipal office term limits. Now, I was advised that the 2023 legislature proposed and passed 8-year term limits for school board members, and in 2024, an effort was put forward to impose the same 8-year limits on county commissioners. But that particular initiative died, I think, in committee. In any case, it failed. Now, according to our lobbyists, they believe it seems inevitable that sooner or later, that focus from school boards to county commissioners would trickle down to the municipal level, and they would begin to try to regulate that as well. No legislation that they're aware of has been introduced up until now. They're just saying, hey, if you're really monitoring what's happening on the landscape, this is one that you should be aware of because it's already been working its way down to your level. Property taxes. The last legislative cycle, which I'll keep referring to as 2024, it seems like it's the current one, but the next one is 2025. So the 2024 one, the one that's already closed, they tried to introduce a study to re-examine property taxes, with the goal basically being to come up with an alternative revenue collection option. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean a lot of different things. In 2024, one of the things they thought it might be is increasing the sales tax. That is, eliminate the property tax, increase the sales tax, but at the same time, reduce local government revenues to help offset the loss in revenue across the board at the state level. So that failed, but we expect, that is our lobbyist team expects, for the same conversation to come back again. What the state is doing in their view, and in the view of others that I've read online, is, well, they're looking at, the increased burden of a lot of different financial burden on residents of a lot of different things, including insurances, property insurance, vehicle insurance, and instead of dealing with the insurance escalations, they're coming up with other ways to help people keep money in their pocket, right? So this property tax study was to say, okay, we have all these property taxes. What if we eliminated them? What would we do and how would that play out? Well, in 2024, they chose, being the legislature, chose not to send that to the Legislative Research Bureau. They have a specific name up in Tallahassee, but I'll call it the Legislative Research Bureau, which is more of a federal title, but it's the same parallel on the state level. They chose not to send it to them because there were, some pretty polarized viewpoints on the question. Some people felt, once Rob Cole pays for his house through his mortgage, he shouldn't have to continue to rent from the state. And they characterized property tax as rent. And along those same lines, they said, and Rob, or a property owner, should not be at risk of losing his home if he fails to pay rent to the state. And to some extent, maybe there's an argument for older Americans being able to stay in their home if that property tax study were to advance and they no longer have to pay property taxes. At least they would not be at risk of losing their home because of a property tax bill that goes unpaid. So that's the argument behind it. And of course, there's counter arguments to it as well. Again, it failed last year. Lobbyist team is just telling us they don't think that topic's going away. It's going to come back, and we'll have to keep monitoring to see what happens. I have 5 more such updates for you if you're wondering how long this list is. All right, so business rent tax elimination. According to the lobbyists, in recent years, the sales tax rate on commercial rentals has been slowly but steadily declining. Florida's state tax on the rental of commercial property had been 4.5%, but the rate was further reduced to 2% effective June 1 of this year, though the reduction does not apply to short-term rentals. Now, I learned that Florida is one of only a few states that charge the tax, and the state legislature, according to our lobbyists, may continue to work towards elimination of the tax. And as I come through some of these, you're going to note a common theme: decreasing municipal revenues, no real concern for what we as municipal governments and employees have to do on the day-to-day basis, and no concern really for how we're going to close that financial gap. So that will be a legislative matter that we'll need to really pay close attention to and potentially develop strategies around. So moving on to the next one, it's another tax, the communication services tax. Now, that's part of the broader effort to reduce taxes generally, and particularly as a means to reduce the impacts of higher property and auto insurance rates. So again, when the state is approached with insurance rates are escalating, they're out of control, you have to help us. We have insurance of last opportunity providers, whatever the terminology is, and I'm getting that wrong. But to combat that, rather than deal with the issue at hand, they're looking for other ways to reduce out-of-pocket expenses for residents and others. So there's a sovereign immunity cap increases. And for the past several years, legislators have grappled with raising sovereign immunity caps, which have not been raised since 2011. Those efforts have ranged from the complete abolishment of the cap to an increasing the caps to doubling or more. Supporters, including the Florida Justice Association, say that increasing the outdated caps is only fair to severely injured plaintiffs who can wait years for the legislature to approve a claims bill. And opponents, on the other hand, argue that doubling the caps would send their insurance premiums skyrocketing and risk ability to provide basic services because you have to reallocate funding from your services to paying for insurance fees. The lobbyist team believes that that is not a topic that's going away. It's going to continue to be revisited from one legislative cycle to the next. Another item, the last of two, or two more there are, millage rate increase limitations. Legislation was filed in 2024 to cap millage rate increases without a supermajority vote of the elected body. So, again, state legislators concerned with our revenues, how we're authorizing increases in taxes, how we're managing that, and they want to increasingly become involved in direct control of those decisions rather than having our local municipal governments retain the authorities that they have. And the last one, environmental funding, and this has its pluses and its minuses, but the lobbyists reported that last year was historic in terms of environmental funding, with the legislature pledging 96% of the Seminole Compact revenue, which is tied to gaming proceeds, to natural resources, translating into upwards of $750 million per year. And our lobbyists believe that effort's going to continue into 2025. Now, we also want to make sure that our state legislature is maintaining support for funding environmental programs of value to our other projects and needs. For instance, if you just look at red tide mitigation funding from 2024, while there was good news on the Seminole Compact side of the equation, the darker side of that same environmental funding equation was that the state was proposing anywhere between, I think it was like 24% and 40% reductions in funding to red tide mitigation. So it's sometimes a little bit of a shell game because you take from one pile and you have to put it somewhere else, and if you add or remove, you have to still balance the budget. So part of our legislative advocacy program is to kind of try to watch how those shifts are taking place, where the money's ebbing from and where it's flowing to, and whether that is advantageous for us as a community and perhaps our partners or not, and then take action accordingly. So one of the biggest threats we have coming up in 2025 is further reduction and elimination of our local government revenue sources. They seem to be under constant and chronic attack in Tallahassee. If we're not vigilant, if we're not working together as municipalities and counties and other partners that we have in the community seeking to do good things, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that our revenues will just continue to be stripped from us. So we're going to have to be strong advocates in that regard and try to really watch bills that have that kind of impact in the budget process as well. Last year, quite a bit of time was spent on various sources of revenue local governments currently have the authority to levy. The expectation from the legislature will always be, according to our lobbyists, that a local government will provide the same level of services expected by our residents, even with less revenue. And we all know how that storyline plays out. We can't continue to do the same thing we've always done, despite changes in our broader economic environment that are increasing costs with less money than what we've ever had. So we're going to have to really watch our revenue sources. And to give you just a general idea, I pulled a report that goes from October 1 of 2022 to September 30 of 2023. And if I combine all the different types of revenues that we receive from the state, that number is about $23.5 million in that year. So it's not small change, right? These are big numbers. And granted, some programs give us more money than others. Ad valorem taxes, $14.7 million. So it's a very large and looming question, and our legislators need to be aware that we need to have our local revenues protected. So that seems to be, at least in our lobbyist view, the greatest threat to local governments is the great deal of pressure that's being applied on the revenues that we presently have authority to collect and use to maintain everything that we want and need to do for the community.
So Mr. Cole, can I mention a couple things? Sure. We have our state rep that lives here, Jim Mooney. We should be, having him come, and Danny Perez, I've been to lunch with him in Miami. I set my own appointment up in Tallahassee when I went and met with Danny. He is a good guy. He is from Miami. So we need to work on, our relationship. We need to have him come to a meeting. We have somebody sitting right here that is like Mr. Mooney's chief of staff, So we have people in our community that, and they can help us in Tallahassee. They know their way around.
Agreed, 100%. And you might recall that one of the first things I called out was building and maintaining relationships, including with our state elected officials. So I don't know, prior to my arrival, how well we did that.
Right.
But that is central to success, is getting to know them, getting to know their staff, making sure that we have open lines of communication and have the opportunity to not only reach out to them through third parties like our lobbyists, but directly. And yes, I think it would be great to provide opportunities that work in their schedules when they're home from session or what have you, to come and at least meet and talk to the community directly through our meetings. So I agree with you 100%.
We have a mayor for Monroe County that's probably did 25 years, but if you take her time working for the state reps and everything, it's been in Tallahassee a long time.
Understood and agreed. I couldn't emphasize that enough, actually.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank
Council,
you.
anybody have any questions or anything they want to ask Mr. Cole? Or
All right. So, go ahead. All right, so what I was going to do now is to just kind of walk through some of the broader categories of legislation and kind of suggest what might be position statements that the village council can react to and say, yes, that's something we would support, or no, or to the extent that there are specific issues that you want me to make note of and incorporate into our legislative agenda that I return back to you in July, I would welcome and encourage that. So, the first heading that I have here is environment, right? So there's a lot of different things that happen under environment. A potential position statement that we might want to incorporate into our legislative agenda would be something to the effect of support legislation and funding programs that cultivate improved environmental outcomes for Isla Morada, our coastal and marine environments, and the Florida Keys generally. Some of these things are going to probably sound a little bit like mom and apple pie because, you know, almost every legislative agenda that I've reviewed basically has a statement that is similar to that, and then it gets fleshed out in a little more detail. So in our local instance, well, what might that mean? And so I've talked to a few different people, and I've woven a few bullet points in that might appear in a more formal, completed legislative agenda coming back to you in July. But things like supporting the continuation of at least $20 million in appropriation for the Florida Keys Stewardship Act to construct water quality improvement projects aimed at improving and restoring the Florida Keys nearshore water quality conditions and habitats. Another subpoint would be support the allocation of at least $5 million from Florida Forever Act funds for land acquisition within the Florida Keys area of critical state concern. And I have about 8 or so of these bullets. I'll read through them if you guys would like me to, sure. Support legislation to fund Florida Keys Stewardship Act from the state's Land Acquisition Trust Fund. Another one, support the continued funding of the Boating Improvement Program, which helps support boating access projects and boating-related activities, which benefits boaters by ensuring safety and access. Then on resilience and flood mitigation funding, support Isla Morada's and Monroe County's resilience projects submitted to DEP's Resilient Florida Grant Program. Another subpoint, support legislation and funding that protects and preserves Florida's coral reef tract. Another bullet, support legislation and funding for the Florida State Parks system. And there's 3 more. Support legislation and funding to support implementation of Everglades restoration projects. And second to last, support the continuing designation and funding of the Florida Keys area of critical state concern. And lastly, oppose legislation that prevents local governments from having local environmental protection programs that are stricter in nature than state or federal regulatory programs. Now, one of the things that I would do between now and July, when I would advance a refined copy of the legislative agenda, is to continue to survey what our partners are doing from an environmental perspective, and then see, given the bullet points that we already have, do they kind of dovetail into that, or is there a new topic maybe that came up that we should be considering? And then I would modify according to that and present it back to council. But given where we're at right now, is there anything that anyone on council would say, look, I didn't hear this in what you've presented so far, and maybe you should add it. Or I don't agree with what you said there, this should probably be taken off. And as we go through it, I welcome that same kind of conversation, but to the extent that I don't have viewpoints or perspectives one way or the other, I'll keep going, but I'll pause at the end of each section to kind of allow that opportunity if you're interested to comment.
All right, council have any questions or comments? Okay. All right.
All right, thank you. Next section, affordable and workforce housing. So a position statement or a potential position statement might be support development of affordable and workforce housing consistent with our comprehensive plan, taking care to monitor for initiatives that negatively preempt local land use and zoning authority, including the requirements in our comprehensive plan and BPAS regulations, which are the corollary to Monroe County's rate of growth ordinance regulations. So basically what that's saying is let's support initiatives that either fund or make it, from a regulatory perspective, favorable to develop workforce and affordable housing, and especially if it is tailored to our local conditions. You know, you always hear that saying, one size can't fit all or doesn't fit all when it comes to state mandated solutions. To the extent that affordable housing or workforce housing rules, regulations, and funding programs can be tailored to our local environment, all the better, because what works in Gainesville may not work in Islamorada. We have completely different conditions that we have to navigate. So again, one size fits all is not a good approach, and we would try to, in the context of this header, be aware of what changes are being made, be aware of how that works or doesn't work, and monitor whether our local home rule authority is being preempted, and report back to council as needed on particular initiatives that are either A, highly beneficial or problematic. So a couple of the things that I gleaned from some of the other legislative agendas that were out there was increased ship and sail funding, including providing temporary flexibility that enables the money to be used to fund across all income categories. So I saw something about that in the Monroe County legislative agenda. Basically, they were saying, and I don't have the numbers right here in front of me, but a substantial portion of their funding could conceivably be lost each year because the way the program is designed, they have to allocate it towards certain socioeconomic subsets of income criteria. Now, if they're unable to, let's say, provide affordable housing to the lowest income bracket, they want to, on a temporary basis, get permission to allocate it towards a bracket where they can actually produce the housing. And instead of saying, sorry, we just can't economically make this happen, so therefore our money is going to go back to the state as unused. So perhaps that would be something we'd want to support, is to, let Monroe County be able to maximize utilization of those state funds without having to return them, yet at the same time cultivate affordable housing outcomes that are really desperately needed throughout the Keys, including Islamorada. Another sub-bullet was support local governments and provide resources to facilitate local solutions. And again, it's one size doesn't fit all. So to the extent that they can enable local governments to modify how the funds are used or to request modifications, I think that would be highly beneficial. And at least one other legislative agenda said something of that same effect. Questions, comments on affordable housing, gaps that we should be addressing? Okay, I'll move on.
I will say one thing.
Yes.
There's other counties and towns that are on the ball with this stuff. When I attended a meeting in Jacksonville, the beginning of the year, what they're doing. East Palatka, Putnam County's building 700 workforce housing. Yeah, D.R. Horton's going to do them, and they're I forget what they're rated. They might not be rated to what we are here, but. Yeah, there's a lot of good things going, so I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think affordable housing is critical in workforce housing. I would argue that, failure to act in that regard not only harms the lowest income earners in the county, but it might also be contributing to a decline or disappearance of the middle class. And I think that's a very unfortunate outcome when you think of how people, especially people born in Islamorada, grow up and try to return, right? If you're coming out of college and you want to return to the community that you grew up in, that's going to be pretty challenging unless you happen to, maybe be a remote worker or happen to have family ties in the community already that can help you dovetail right into a higher paying job. If you come in as a police or fireman or a teacher, and we really want to, have a stable community representative of all socioeconomic segments, affordable housing is absolutely essential, and those benefits of having a diverse population are lost if we're not making the right kinds of investments. So. All right, next category, children and families. The position statement that might go along with that would be support maintaining funding for children in need of services, the SINS program, and families in need of services, another state program, both of which help finance activities undertaken by local organizations like the Florida Keys Children's Shelter. We don't have a lot of subpoints on that as of yet, and I'll have to review a few more legislative agendas to see what's really happening in that area, but suffice it to say those two programs were highlighted at least in one of the agendas as requiring continuing to support to help with those targeted populations. Questions, comments? Okay. Next, insurance, wind and flood. Now, A potential policy statement in that area would be to oppose efforts to increase premiums, eliminate the cap on annual increases, reduce coverage, or reduce eligibility. And all of those things, I guess, have been happening over time with increasing frequency and severity. So it's a very challenging environment to negotiate. As I had mentioned earlier, the state, thus far, according to our lobbyists, has been reluctant to take a lot of meaningful action on this front, and instead have chosen to kind of bite at the heels of it by giving tax relief and reducing the tax burden on residents, with the belief that by allowing them to save money on taxes there, they may have more money to pay continuing escalating wind and flood insurance costs. I think that there's a wide swath of people in Monroe County that disagree with that approach and would like to see more meaningful change when it comes to wind insurance and flood insurance premiums and how those are controlled and monitored by the state. So what I found in looking at least some of the legislative agendas, including firms, was wind insurance, and more recently flood insurance, is a perennial legislative priority in Monroe County. To make matters worse, flood insurance must now be carried by all citizens, the insurer of last resort, policyholders, even for homes not at risk for flood. The cost for flood insurance is increasing because of Risk Rating 2.0, FEMA's pricing scheme for National Flood Insurance Program policies. Risk Rating 2.0 also eliminates the preferred risk policies that were once offered very inexpensively for homes not at risk of flood. Our proposal in this regard is to continue to monitor the landscape and try to influence it in favor of positions that would be favorable to our community. And we'll work with our delegation, Monroe County, other municipalities, our insurance advocacy group, firm, and try to seek relevant reforms that aren't just, shell games moving, the money's around from one place to another, harming us at the same time, but instead, hopefully, directly focused on the problem and cultivating meaningful solutions. But there has been a substantial level of resistance at the state level to address that issue directly. Questions, comments? Okay, home rule and unfunded mandates. A position statement might be something to the effect of oppose efforts to preempt local legislative authority, including our ability to regulate short-term rentals, as well as unfunded mandates. So if the state wants us to execute program services, what have you, by legislative mandate, they should give us funding to see that it happens. They can't continue to work towards reducing our revenue streams while at the same time providing us with new obligations that are not attached to funding to help us make them happen. And again, preempting local legislative authority is something that we want to firmly oppose because we need to retain our ability to tailor policies, local laws, programs to meet our local needs because as much as Tallahassee may think they can develop one-size-fits-all solutions, it really doesn't work. And you really need to have a good pulse on what's happening in a micro environment to be able to tailor regulations in such a way that you don't cultivate unintended outcomes while you're trying to promote a positive outcome. Questions or comments on that? Okay, I have two more left. First one, infrastructure, state of good repair, storm hardening, and resilience. Typical position statement on that might read, support funding programs and services that recognize and help to address current and emerging infrastructure needs, particularly those associated with climate adaptation and resilience. And arguably, there's few places in the state of Florida that is more relevant to than the Florida Keys, and we all need to collaborate together to make sure that Tallahassee recognizes not only our needs in that regard, but also the fact that we are a very huge net donor in terms of taxes that flow up to Tallahassee, and some of that money should come back our way to help protect the revenue generation that the Keys produces for the state based on tourism and other factors. I once read, and I'm not sure if it's still accurate, but I think the Florida Keys were the #2 tax generator for the state of Florida outside of Orlando and Disney. And if that's still true, one certainly can make the argument that these needs that we're expressing in our legislative agenda and later in primers and things really do deserve legislative attention and focus. And I think that our legislators have been doing a great job in helping us gain access to grant opportunities in the past, even though our legislative program perhaps hasn't been fully structured and implemented on a consistent basis. So they've been watching out for us, in other words, even if we haven't been entirely as effective as what we would like to be in advancing and calling out and communicating about our needs, including, again, visits with our legislators and their staff. And then the last one, transportation, a potential position statement that the board might endorse would be support programs and legislation that cultivate and maintain a multimodal transportation network serving Isla Mirada and the Florida Keys. We know that we have Freebie. We get a FDOT grant that helps support that program. We know that there's a vision at Monroe County to have a more seamless transit system from one end of the Keys to the other so that people can use it more effectively and efficiently. We know that level of service on our roadways is terrible. We've all sat in traffic. We've all sat there parked. I sat the other day, I don't know how long. I could see Village Hall. And I, in theory, could have jumped the fog line and rode the shoulder to get down to Village Hall, but I'm not going to illegally pass. I'm going to sit there and wait in traffic, even if it takes me 5 minutes to get to that next driveway before I can turn in. So we've all been there. How do you deal with that? Well, legislatively, maybe there's programs that can help at least shift some of that car driver activity into other modes where, it's a lot more efficient to put a bunch of people into a bus than it is to have 30 cars trying to make their way through the same amount of space, right? But it has to be a viable transit alternative, and that's going to take time and money and the right kind of legislative mindset up in Tallahassee to recognize the problem and invest in it. So that would be a position statement that we can potentially make. I'd like to see the trail that we have be a little bit safer for people of all capabilities. As it stands now, it's kind of intermittent. It's a designated state trail. It's in theory, it could be a global amenity. I mean, imagine how beautiful that would be to go from Homestead to Key West on a safe trail where you can ride your bike or you can walk or what have you and see all of the beautiful water and the wildlife along the way. But right now, you come to each of those bridges and you're putting your life at risk just trying to make it across the bridge because you're effectively on the shoulder of a high-speed thoroughfare. And that doesn't make for much of a trail. I hike an awful lot, and I'll tell you what, that's the only trail I know of where I have to hike on road to just continue the trail. The Appalachian Trail has some road crossings, I'll grant you that, but none of them are, where you're walking with your back to cars that are not paying attention because they're all looking at the beautiful blue water, and we have enough accidents on the roadway that kind of, really highlight that there's a lot of distractions on the overseas highway, and not just people using cell phones, but people really just enjoying our lovely scenery that each of you grew up with and got to appreciate. They like to appreciate it too as they're driving. I just don't want to be the person walking within 2 feet of that fog line as they're appreciating our wonderful scenery. So maybe there's some room for transportation investments as well.
Well, Mr. Cole, you mentioned that. I just rode a lot in Flagler County on Sunday, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the Animal Land. It was Animal Land, and Flagler, IT&T ended up buying it and gave it to Flagler County, and they have, like motocross, double diamond for bikers, and you can go in there and you got walking, they got biking, and you go through canopies of these trees. It's beautiful. It goes all through Flagler County. That whole area. Mark knows a lot about that too up there in Putnam County and in Palatka. It's called the Rails to Trails.
Right, I've actually been on that trail.
Yeah.
It's impressive. And we have, when you think of how beautiful a trail like that is, just imagine one from Key West to Homestead that emulated some of those safety elements and allowed people to actually use it and feel safe. And a kid could ride his or her bike out there without the parents being afraid that they're going to be run over as they go from, one bridge to another bridge crossing. It would just be a phenomenal project if that something like that could ever be realized. I'm drifting a little bit off of our legislative workshop because I really have a passion for that, Mayor.
I know you do.
And I could talk forever about this kind of topic, so I'll stop. And I just want to say that the next steps for this would be for me to, continue to flesh out the legislative agenda, consistent with some of the policy statements that I've made here, bring it back to this group in July, have you guys say, yeah, I think this is pretty close. It's a policy level document. It's not intended to be granular. And then we head into budget. We get our budget moving along. We identify a few projects, not too many, put them into priority sheets, and continue to plug along. And then once a session begins to roll around and we see some of the other legislative agendas that are really getting underway in earnest, we'll monitor those and tweak ours as we go. But number one, and running in the background, as you said, Mayor, is we have to have relationships with our elected officials and their staff. So that's one of the tasks on my list of things to do. And I've spoken with our lobbyists already in part to help me get some of those meetings set up.
Awesome.
And that concludes my presentation for the evening.
Like to comment?
Yeah.
Mr. Cole?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I appreciate your work. This was you really jumped into the fire on this one, and I'm thrilled to see this kind of beginning to this process. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. All right. So with that being said, I think we need to probably move on to public comment, right, according to the agenda. Marnie, is there any public comment?
This is actually a workshop, so it's public comment's not required.
Okay, all right, all
No
right.
one has signed up either.
Okay, nobody signed up. Okay, wow. I'm just following the agenda, that's all. Okay.
Agreed.
Mr. Cole, thank you so much, because it really is, we really got to put an emphasis on this, and we got to stay proactive on it and make some good things happen.
Thank you.
Get our fair share of the money.
We'll be giving it our best shot.
All right, all right. Council, nobody else has, okay. All right, with that being said, we are adjourned, and it'll be just a few minutes, I think, Vince, 5 minutes before we start our regular scheduled council meeting, get changed over here. So bear with us. Thank you.